Dance on the moon, sleep on a star. Love will be with us wherever we are. Let time stand still, life is too soon till it's over. Dance on the moon.
I started writing this book after I wrote the book The Messenger about my grandfather on my father's side. For years I thought about writing this book. It is not a book of enlightenment. It's a book of passion. It's a book of dedication, of love, and raising kids in very difficult circumstances. And when I say raising kids, you have to understand what Grace went through to get where we are. And I need to show you my board here. This is Grace's life and her death and all that followed. That little pink strip right there is Grace. My book starts with William Speed Colonel Hammond, who is my great-great-grandfather. And he is generation 2. His father, Peter, was the first one on Big Laurel Mountain, where all of this takes place. Big Laurel Mountain is in the eastern part of Kentucky, 22 miles southwest of Louisa. And what you see in this board are all of us that followed Grace. The only reason I expanded this side is to show you the importance of Grace and why she is so important to us, because all that you see that followed, all the way down to our very first person in the 9th generation, Jackson. Garrett, Taylor's father, was one of 13 boys and girls, yellow being girls, blue being boys. All I have done is tracked one individual, and that is Garrett and Taylor. If I had tracked everybody, I would have names from here to Poplar Avenue. Grace was born and raised in a little town called Peach Orchard, and Peach Orchard is 22 miles southwest of Louisa, Kentucky. This red button right here is where Grace was born, her mother Sarah was born, and her father was born. This map and this little red button is where Taylor was born, my grandfather. You can see this distance traverses 3 mountains, but it's not that far apart. Taylor lived in this house until he was 12 years old, and then he moved here. When he married Grace, they moved here. This little stream is called Laurel Creek, and in their lives in Kentucky, they never went further than this little small area. Grace was raised in this house of Joe Chapman. When she married Taylor, they built a cabin and lived not a half a mile away. If you look at Rebecca's birthday, she was born in 1866. If you look at when she had her first child, he was born in 1878. That's 12 years. She was 12 years old when she had her first child. All of these, from here to here, were Rebecca's children. Frank, James, William, Taylor, Julie, and Henry. She died almost immediately after Henry. We think of childbirth kind of causes. And then Garrett, who married the 12-year-old, married a 15-year-old. And she, Telly is her name, had 7 more children. So Taylor had these brothers and sisters: Frank, James, William, Julie, Henry, Elizabeth, Rebecca, Clifford, Grady, Goldie, Elsie, and Nelson. All of those brothers and sisters of Taylor. And Rebecca was 12 years old when the first one. Speaking of Rebecca, I looked for years. What does Rebecca look like? What does she look like? We couldn't find her death certificate. We couldn't find her birth certificate. We could find nothing about her. On my last trip to Kentucky, a lady that lived down the street from the old home place, which is this place right here, brought a stack of papers for me to look at. And in that stack of papers is this picture right here. And I got my magnifying glass and I studied every face in this picture. It's a picture of the church members of the church that's on Laurel Mountain, this church right here. And they all agreed that that was the picture of the church, the mountain behind it, and all of the members. And I concentrated on that gentleman right there. That gentleman is the same as that gentleman, who is Garrett, Taylor's father, Garrett. And the young lady standing in front of him is Rebecca, our great-grandmother. My wife and I had an errand to run, so I got up, got dressed, went to my favorite chair, and sat down. And during that time, I would doze in and out of sleep. I would wake up and I'd doze off, and I'd wake up and doze off. At some point, while I had dozed off, I heard two women walk in the room. And it was almost like they walked in one door, walked by me, and walked out another door. So their voices were very muted as they came and went, but distinct when they were right in front of me. And at the point when they were right in front of me, I heard one woman say to the other, "Lending Stewart's cabin." And it was so distinct that it woke me up. And when Tay walked in the room, my eyes must have been big as saucers, because she said, "What's wrong?" Well, I said, "Just a minute." So I got up and wrote down what I had just heard: Lending Stewart's cabin. We went on our errand, we came back home, and I got on the internet looking for Lending Stewart's cabin. I found a Boy Scout camp in North Carolina called Stewart's Cabin, only it was spelled differently than I had been spelling it. I had been spelling it as S-T-A-U-R-T, but the cabin was S-T-E-W-A-R-T. So I went back through my entire search again. Finally, I found a blog. I said to myself, if this is something somebody's trying to tell you, you have to narrow it. What is it that they're trying to tell you? Well, I had just written the book, The Messenger. And so it was a book in West Virginia, staged in West Virginia. So I went back and I looked for Stewart's Cabin / West Virginia. And the first thing that popped up was a blog from J and J Stewart, S-T-E-W-A-R-T-S. So I went to the blog. They were from Cabin Creek, West Virginia. So I went to the blog site, and the blog said, "We are looking for any information we can find about my grandfather, whose name is Andrew Stewart." Well, Andrew, the name, brought me to that attention because my book, The Messenger, was about Andrew Chafin. So when I saw Andrew, I said, okay. So I went. They said, if you can find out anything about Andrew Stewart, let us know. Well, I assumed to myself they'd never heard of Ancestry.com, so I went immediately to Ancestry.com. And in Ancestry.com, I did find Andrew Stewart. His father's name was Lyndon. Lyndon Stewart was born in Peach Orchard, Kentucky in 1870. Sarah, my great-grandmother, was born in Peach Orchard, Kentucky in 1874, 4 years later. They lived 4 houses apart. Lyndon Stewart became very successful. His father was a lawyer, and he was the lawyer for the Peach Orchard Mining Company. And he had a very successful business in downtown Louisa doing business for the Peach Orchard Mining Company. His son Lyndon joined the firm, and at the age of 24 got his law license, still working for his father. And he was the one that my grandmother Sarah went to see when she needed a divorce from Joe Markham. He had a cabin where he lived directly behind his father's estate in downtown Louisa. And I am convinced that what I heard was the voice from Sarah telling me about Lyndon Stewart, and if they had an encounter in that cabin behind his parents' home. Sarah, Grace's mother, was indeed pregnant with Grace when she married Joe Chapman and moved next door to my grandfather, Taylor. I have given you 2 sections of my book. It's actually in 3 parts. I've given you the first part, which is bringing Taylor to an age where he meets Grace on Big Laurel Mountain. They met in a 1-room schoolhouse on Laurel Creek, and he was in the 5th grade when she was in the 1st grade. Ultimately, when he was 22 and she was 16, they married. And they moved sometime after that in 1915. They married in 1912. They moved to Williamson in 1915 when my mother, Eva Lou, would have been 6 months or so old. I assume that they delayed their move to Williamson until she was old enough to travel. They moved to Williamson in the heart of the Mingo County mining wars, when we were making national headlines for all the corruption and death and absolute horrible working conditions of the miners in Mingo County, West Virginia. They had no idea what they were getting into when they moved to Williamson and went to work. Taylor went to work with his brother Henry in the mines in Mingo County. They worked 12 hours a day on their knees or on their back mining coal, and they were paid 35 cents a ton to bring that coal out of that mine. 35 cents a ton. So they would work 12-hour days, 7 days a week for 20 bucks. And that was not the worst part. The worst part was they had to live in tents. Not homes, they lived in tents. No heat except what a potbelly stove would give you. No running water except for what you could carry from the creek. Only outside toilets. And no lights after dark, so the animals would roam around looking for whatever food they could find. And that is the way Grace raised my mother and her 2 brothers. My grandfather, Taylor, became a union activist because he was tired of living like he was living, and he was tired of forcing his wife, Grace, and his children into living the way they lived. And so he became a union activist, trying to get the union in to his camp to improve their working conditions. He worked for the Superior Thacker Mining Company in a little mining camp called Gardner, Garner. The company wanted so badly to keep the unions out that they literally disposed of anyone who they felt was trying to get the unions in what they called an accident. Never reported to a single soul except the West Virginia Safety Commission. That was it. They didn't even report it to the local sheriff. My grandfather was executed as he left the mines by a 2,300 volt bare wire that dropped down from the opening of the mine just at the time that he alone was passing under it. I think, and probably never be proven, that they killed him for the reason that he was trying his best to improve his life and that of his family. That leaves Grace trying to raise 3 children on no money. The mining company kicked her out of the tent, but after the union signed a contract, she was given $5 a week for each of her 3 children. And so she took that money and she bought or rented a place in downtown Williamson, West Virginia for $8 a month, and she moved her family to Williamson. You cannot feed a family on $15 a month. $8 a month, which went to rent the house. My grandmother bought a used washing machine. She took in laundry, but the people around her were so poor, very few of them could give her laundry to do. She hardly hadn't made enough money to pay the payment on the used washing machine. She went to the county to ask for their help. They told her they had no money to help her because the only money they had were for those people who were bedridden. That was it. That was the only funds available. So since she was not bedridden, they could not give her any money. After 2 years of fighting and trying to support her kids, she really did reach bottom when she agreed with her half-brother to sell moonshine for him, booze. She didn't really sell it. This is the interesting part of that. The moonshiner, who is Chapman, who raised her, had a big market in West Virginia for moonshine, but he couldn't get anybody to take it across the state line from Kentucky to West Virginia. They conned my grandmother Grace, and they said, look, this is all you have to do. You get on a train from Williamson to Catlettsburg every 8 days. That's to make sure she didn't travel on the same day every week. Every 8 days, she would get on that train and she would go to Catlettsburg, and they would meet her there with a satchel, a cloth satchel, in which there were 6 to 8 jars of moonshine. She would take that satchel back home and put it in her closet. That is the only time she ever touched the product. They would then pick it up, deliver it, and they gave her $2 for each of those pints of moonshine. So she would make $12 to $16 a week, which was an amazing amount of money for my grandmother. She had never seen that much money before. The problem was that she was committing a felony, and those who were picking it up at her doorstep and delivering it were committing a misdemeanor. And so when she was caught, she was convicted, and she was sentenced to 2.5 years in state penitentiary. Those who picked up the booze from her and sold it got 6 months. She was arrested, thrown in prison, and left her 3 kids on the streets with absolutely no support. We went back to the old home place, which is that log cabin I showed you earlier. And the lady who lives there now, Jenny Preston, said that there were a whole bunch of papers upstairs, and she didn't know anything about what they were, but I asked her to go get them, and she brought them down. This map was one of those papers. I had to beg her to let me take the original out of the house, and I brought it to Memphis, and I took it to a mapping place, and they reproduced it, and then I sent her the original back. But the map was made, we know, sometime between 1912 and 1915, because my mother was born on 1915. And this map shows us where my mother was born. And this map, if you look right there, it says Taylor Hammond Residence. That's the most important thing that we have found in all of my years of looking for stories of grace. My mother was born right there, delivered by her father, Taylor Hammond.
Dance on the moon, sleep on a star. Love will be with us wherever we are. Let time stand still, life is too soon till it's over. Dance on the moon.